Okay, so today I'm going to talk to you a little bit about Mars. So Mars, it's actually my favorite planet behind the Earth. The reason being, uh, besides the fact that we're probably going to be going to visit sometime in the next decade, it's going to be there's going to be a lot of interesting things happening with Mars over the next 10 years. Definitely with SpaceX and NASA wanting to go back. But it's my favorite planet other than the Earth just because of all the surface features. The surface features on Mars are huge, and we'll talk more about those as we go. And then another interesting thing about Mars, one of the reasons I like it is because of the fact that there could be life on Mars. There could be bacterial forms of life, and it'll be interesting to see what happens when we actually go there to see what kind of life we find. So I always like to throw this picture on. This is called the face on Mars. Back when we were visiting Mars for one of the first times, we imaged the planet and we saw this face. And I'll show you what it actually looks like later on. But there's been several instances throughout history where people looking up at Mars just they believe, there's little green men. There's so many movies about Martians being from Mars, aliens being from Mars called Martians. And we're going to talk about why that is as we go. So this picture isn't the greatest of Mars, but you can see Mars does have a red color to it. The surface is actually red, and the reason it is red is because it's covered with iron oxide, which is rust. So the entire surface is kind of covered with rust. And then it also has these polar ice caps. There's a northern polar ice cap, and there's also a southern polar ice cap as well. And what those polar ice caps are, it's made of dry ice and water ice, actually. So frozen carbon dioxide and frozen water. Mars, it's pretty close to us as well. It's 1.5 AUs away. When we go visit it whenever humans decide to go and explore it, it'll take about a year to get there. So there's the face on Mars. So here are a couple of the surface features I want you to know for your tests. So these surface features, like I said earlier, these are huge. So it does have quite a few volcanoes. It is not is not active right now. So these are just old volcanoes, but these are called the Tharsis Mountains, Tharsis volcanoes, these three peaks. And these volcanoes, they dwarf Mount Everest. And these are not even the largest volcanoes. And then there's this is called Valles Marineris, which is the Mariner Valley. So Mariner Valley, this thing is huge. This thing would extend across the United States if you put it on the U.S. This dwarfs the Grand Canyon. Later on, I'll show you an actual size comparison of the two, but you can see here that's 3,000 miles across. So Mariner Valley and the Tharsis volcanoes, those are huge surface features. It'd be kind of fun to go and climb up these or go climbing down Mariner Valley. So one of the reasons we have so many movies that deal with Mars and Martians is because of this guy. He's called Percival Lowell. So Percival Lowell was he had some money and he built his own telescopes. And with those telescopes, he liked to look at Mars. And when he was looking at Mars, he thought he saw water channels or channels of water, which are called canali. And those canali, he believed, were actually irrigation systems that aliens built on Mars. And so he pictured these aliens up on Mars with all this agriculture and stuff, all these plants being grown on Mars. And he drew his images of what he saw on these plates. And so that's why we always think of Mars with little green men, because one of the big reasons is Percival Lowell here. So he discovered canali, which are water channels. Make sure we know what canali are. So this is what Mars looks like here. You can see the red color, it's red-brown color, and that, again, that's iron oxide, which is rust. So a couple facts about Mars. It is very similar to the Earth in that a day on Mars, it's called a sol, and one sol is 24 hours and 37 minutes. And then a year on Mars is actually 687 days. Since it's further away, it's going to take a lot longer for it to revolve. We've been to Mars several times. We'll talk about that later on. But mass, it is quite small compared to the Earth. The mass is 1/9. And the diameter, I don't know if I said that or not, but the diameter is actually 1/2 that of the Earth. So it's about 1/2 the Earth's size, 1/9 of the mass of the Earth. Axis tilt, it's also quite similar to the Earth. So if you remember the Earth is 23.5 degrees, The axis tilt of Mars is 25.19 degrees. So since it's so close, that means that it has what, guys? It has seasons. Yes, it has seasons just like the Earth. Mars does currently have a thin atmosphere of carbon dioxide and nitrogen. Most of it's carbon dioxide, about 97% of it's carbon dioxide. Looks like 2.7% is nitrogen. But most of the atmosphere, it was actually lost. And the reason it was lost is because Mars is just too small. So what happened was is all the water that could have accumulated in the atmosphere, water vapor, it actually, most of it froze. And then it also was lost to space because of the escape velocity. So since Mars is so small, it was easier for those gases to escape. So permafrost here, subsurface permafrost. Permafrost means the soil of Mars, the crust of Mars is frozen, and a lot of that water is frozen up in Mars. So there is evidence from the latest missions that we've sent to Mars with the Curiosity rover and a couple other satellites orbiting Mars. But there's evidence that there's actually liquid water on the surface of Mars still. And Mars could have once had a lot more water, like just big lakes of water, but currently most of it is actually frozen. So it was lost to space, subsurface permafrost, and the polar ice caps. That's what happened to the atmosphere. So it's a very thin layer. So if you're on Mars looking out into space, it would not look like it would not look like space from like when you're on the moon and looking out. Since there is an atmosphere, it looks like it's kind of like in a desert on the Earth. You could be somewhere in a desert on the Earth. That's kind of what it looks like. I'll show you what it looks like in just a little bit. So the reason that red color is because it is made of iron, lots of iron, which makes it rust. I already told you this, but the polar ice caps are made of carbon dioxide and water. So Earth has ice caps, and then Mars has polar ice caps as well. Make sure you know that as well for your test. So there's lots of evidence for big qualities of water on Mars. Every time we send a new mission up, we learn more and more about the water, how much water there actually is. So we just said that water is locked up in the permafrost and the polar ice caps. So this just shows you what polar ice caps look like. There's the North Pole and there's the South Pole. I'll move on through this so we can get done with these. I'm not going to read this to you. This just kind of explains what I've already told you about what happened to the water. So it's all frozen in those ice caps. So a couple other surface features I want you to know. Mars does have the largest mountain in the solar system. It's called Olympus Mons, or Mount Olympus. That's the largest one in the solar system. Oh, and Mars, I didn't tell you why Mars has the name Mars. So Mars is named after a god of war. And the reason being, when you look at Mars, it does look red. And so we've already know why the surface looks red. So if you're looking at it through a telescope, it does look red. And red, you think red color, you think blood. So it just makes sense to name Mars after the god of war. So Olympus Mons is the largest volcano in the solar system. It is huge. This thing is over 3.5 times the size of Mount Everest. So this is an image of it from space. All this white stuff you see, that's the atmosphere, and it's also a bunch of frozen carbon dioxide clouds, like dry ice. It has dry ice clouds. So largest volcano in the solar system, 27 kilometers high, which is 16 miles high. So this thing is absolutely huge. Mount Everest, to give you a comparison, is 4.9 miles high, so it makes it over 3.5 times the size of Everest. That is quite large. Make sure you know that. That will be a test question for sure. This is a computer-generated image of what Olympus Mons would look like if you were on the surface, if you were from space. You can see how flat it is right here. And then it's huge. It dwarfs everything else. So that's why Mars is my favorite planet, because of the Tharsis volcanoes, Olympus Mons, and Mariner Valley. It's got so many large surface features. There is evidence of a bunch of water flow and lava flows. I already mentioned these. This shows you how big Mariner Valley would be if you put it on the United States. So you can see right here how it crosses it would cross the entire U.S. So this thing is huge. There's Mariner Valley here, and this is if you put the United States on Mars, how big Mariner Valley would be. And these over here, those are the Tharsis volcanoes again. This shows you the depth of Mariner Valley compared to the Grand Canyon. So if you've ever been to the Grand Canyon looks huge. And this is how deep the Grand Canyon would be compared to Mariner Valley here, which goes all the way down here. So again, Mariner Valley just dwarfs the Grand Canyon in comparison. So I told you about Canali. So we said Earth-based observations of these water channels were named Canali by Percival Lowell. And that's what gave us the idea for all those Martians, those little green men. Make sure that Canali, or water channels, is actually called Canali on Mars. So I'm just going to move on because these are just pictures of different surface features. There are craters on Mars as well. This shows you how big some of those volcanoes are. The Tharsis volcanoes, stretching 430 miles across, 450 miles here. These things are huge. Here's Olympus Mons. Here's the Tharsis volcanoes, if you were to put them as a comparison for the United States. So huge surface features. So this face on Mars, a lot of people, when they first saw this image, it was a very low resolution image, and a lot of people actually thought that maybe some aliens carved this face into the surface as like a map as to where the aliens are. But this is actually what it looks like when we went back and observed this face with high resolution. It's actually just a couple of rolling hills. That's what it looks like. And then this is what it looks like with higher resolution compared to low resolution. So it doesn't really look like a face on Mars to me, but it was a really popular image at the time, and had a lot of people believing that there were actually faces carved into the side of Mars.